You've been so afraid of being alone that you've forgotten who you are when no one needs you. What if the emptiness you feel in solitude isn't because you're broken, but because you've been performing for so long that silence feels like death? If you keep running from yourself, you'll spend your whole life being everything to everyone and nothing to the person who matters most. But there's something Carl Jung understood about the soul that might change everything. Elena sits in her apartment at 2 a.m., scrolling through her phone for the third time in 10 minutes. No missed calls, no urgent texts, no crisis to solve. For the first time in months, nobody needs her. And instead of feeling relieved, she feels invisible. The silence in her apartment isn't peaceful, it's deafening. It's the sound of a life that only knows how to exist in relationship to other people's pain. Elena checks her work email. Nothing urgent. She scrolls through social media, looking for anyone who might need advice, support, a shoulder to cry on. But tonight, her friends are fine. Her family is managing. Her coworkers aren't having breakdowns. And Elena? Elena is having an existential crisis in the space between her couch cushions. This is the moment that breaks most empaths. Not rejection, not abandonment, but the terrifying realization that without someone to save, fix, or heal, they don't know who they are. Elena has spent her entire adult life believing her worth lived in her usefulness. When her friends stopped calling with their problems, when her family learned to manage without her constant support, when her romantic partner finally said, "I'm fine," really, she didn't feel free. She felt erased. This is what Carl Jung called the shadow of the helper. The dark mirror of empathy that whispers, if you're not needed, you don't exist. But tonight, Elena is about to discover something that will shatter everything she thought she knew about love, worth, and what it means to be strong. Take a breath with me. Notice what you're feeling right now. Does Elena's story sound familiar? Can you feel that particular brand of panic that comes not from being overwhelmed, but from being unnecessary? This isn't a story about being too sensitive. This is a story about what happens when your entire identity becomes entangled with other people's needs, and the terrifying moment when you realize you've lost yourself in the process. Jung taught us that we all wear masks, personas we've crafted to survive in the world. But for empaths like Elena, the mask isn't just social courtesy. It's a life support system. The helper persona says, "I matter because I give. I'm valuable because I sacrifice. I'm loved because I'm needed." But beneath this beautiful, exhausted mask lives the shadow, the part of yourself you've abandoned to keep everyone else happy. The shadow whispers the truths you're too afraid to speak. I'm tired of being everyone's therapist. I want someone to take care of me. I'm angry that my pain doesn't matter as much as theirs. Listen carefully. This isn't selfishness. This is your soul begging to be seen. Let me tell you about Marcus, a 34-year-old social worker who spent his days healing trauma and his nights lying awake wondering if anyone would love him if he stopped being useful. Marcus had perfected the art of emotional camouflage. At work, he was the therapist who never had bad days. With friends, he was the listener who never needed to be heard. In relationships, he was the giver who never asked for anything in return. He had learned this dance early. Growing up in a household where emotions were either explosive or completely suppressed, Marcus discovered that the safest place to exist was in service to others. When his parents fought, he became the mediator. When his sister struggled, he became her therapist. When his friends faced crises, he became their rock. Somewhere along the way, Marcus stopped asking what he needed and started scanning the room for what everyone else was missing. But late at night, when the performance ended, Marcus felt something terrifying: rage. Rage at being the emotional garbage disposal for everyone's pain. Rage at being seen as endlessly strong while secretly crumbling. Rage at loving people who only seemed to love what he could do for them, not who he was when he couldn't do anything at all. This rage wasn't a character flaw. It was his psyche's emergency signal, a desperate cry from the parts of himself he'd locked away to become the perfect helper. Carl Jung's shadow work reveals what most of us fear to admit. The parts we repress don't disappear, they distort. They leak into our relationships as resentment, exhaustion, even illness. Jung called this process projection. We give away the parts of ourselves we're afraid to own, then wonder why we feel empty. Marcus projected his need for care onto others, then resented them for not magically knowing he was drowning. He projected his desire for rest onto others, then felt guilty for wanting what he freely gave. He projected his hunger for unconditional love onto others, then felt abandoned when they couldn't fill a void he'd been digging for years. Here's what Jung understood about this split. The more we deny our shadow, the more it controls us from the unconscious. Marcus wasn't just helping others. He was unconsciously trying to heal the abandoned child inside himself by becoming the rescuer he'd always needed. But every time he saved someone else, that inner child felt more abandoned. Because the rescue was always happening out there, never in here. The split was killing him slowly. The helper grew more exhausted. The shadow grew more enraged. And the real Marcus, the one beneath both masks, remained invisible, even to himself. Jung wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." Marcus was irritated by people who seemed to effortlessly put themselves first. People who could say no without guilt. People who could be loved without earning it. What he didn't realize was that his irritation was actually envy, pointing him toward the very parts of himself he'd exiled to become the perfect helper. Until one Thursday evening, when something shifted, Marcus came home to his empty apartment, and instead of immediately reaching for his phone to check on someone, he just sat in the silence. He heard something he'd been avoiding for years. His own voice, asking a question that changed everything. Who am I when I'm not saving anyone? The question hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore. And for the first time in his adult life, Marcus didn't try to distract himself from the discomfort of not knowing the answer. The truth that shattered Marcus, and might shatter you, is this. You're not afraid of loneliness. You're afraid of uselessness. Somewhere along the way, you learned that your value was conditional. That love was something you earned through service, not something you deserved through existence. You learned that your feelings were too much, so you became a container for everyone else's emotions instead. You learned that your needs were inconvenient, so you became hypervigilant to everyone else's needs instead. You learned that your authentic self was somehow not enough, so you built a beautiful, helpful, endlessly giving false self instead. But Carl Jung understood something profound about this process. He wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is being who you are, not who you think you should be, not who everyone needs you to be, who you actually are. The breakdown isn't coming because you're weak. It's coming because your soul is exhausted from hiding." Marcus sat in his apartment that Thursday night and felt something crack open inside his chest, not breaking, but awakening. For the first time in years, he wasn't trying to fix anyone. He wasn't solving problems or managing emotions or being strong for someone else. He was just there, with himself, in the quiet. And instead of the crushing emptiness he expected, he felt something else. Curiosity. What do I actually want? He whispered to the silence. The question hung in the air like a prayer he'd forgotten how to say. He realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd asked himself what he wanted, rather than what everyone else needed. He couldn't remember the last time he'd sat still without immediately looking for someone to help. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt his own feelings without immediately trying to fix them, or hide them, or use them to understand someone else better. This moment of recognition was what Jung called the confrontation with the shadow. The terrifying and liberating moment when you stop running from the parts of yourself you've been afraid to acknowledge. Marcus began to see the intricate web he'd woven around his identity. He didn't just help people. He needed people to need him, because their need validated his existence in a way that his simple presence never could. But why? Why had he become so afraid of his own inherent worth that he had to earn it through service? The memory surfaced slowly, like a photograph developing in a darkroom. He was 7 years old, sitting in his bedroom while his parents screamed at each other downstairs. His little sister was crying in the next room, and Marcus, tiny, helpless Marcus, had a revelation that would shape the next 27 years of his life. If he could just fix this situation, if he could just make everyone happy, if he could just be useful enough, then maybe the chaos would stop. And it worked. When he comforted his sister, the crying stopped. When he cracked jokes during family dinners, the tension lifted. When he became the family's emotional mediator, he earned something that felt like love. But it was conditional love. Love based on performance. Love that required him to abandon himself to maintain it. Jung called this the false self, a carefully constructed identity that earns approval but costs the soul. Marcus wasn't having a breakdown. He was having a breakthrough into the truth he'd been running from. He had been so busy being needed that he'd forgotten how to simply exist. The fear wasn't really about being alone. The fear was about discovering that he was a whole person, worthy of love and care and attention, even when he wasn't performing the role of the helper. Especially when he wasn't performing the role of the helper. This is what Jung meant when he wrote about the transcendent function, the moment when a conscious mind stops fighting the unconscious, and something new emerges from the collision. Marcus was discovering that beneath the helper and beneath the shadow lived something else. His authentic self. The self that existed before he learned to perform love. The self that was inherently valuable, not because of what he did, but because of what he was. But this recognition came with a terrifying implication. If he was valuable simply for existing, then what did that mean about all the years he'd spent earning his worth through service? What did it mean about the relationships built on his usefulness? What did it mean about his entire identity? Take a moment. Feel this truth in your body. What happens when you imagine being loved, not for what you do, but for who you are? Jung wrote, "Your vision becomes clear when you look into your heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens." Marcus was finally looking inside, and what he found there would change everything. But first he had to grieve, because recognizing your authentic worth means mourning all the years you spent believing you had earned it. And that grief? That was just the beginning. 3 months later, Anna, Elena's friend who had watched her own helper crisis unfold, found herself in the same place Marcus had been, alone, but this time choosing it. Anna had always been the friend who dropped everything for a crisis call, the daughter who managed family drama, the partner who fixed what was broken. But something had shifted after watching Elena's journey. Anna started to notice the pattern. Every time she felt anxious or uncertain about her own life, she immediately looked for someone else to help. It was an unconscious ritual. Feel scared? Fix someone else. Feel sad? Become someone else's therapist. Feel lost? Find someone who needed saving. The helping wasn't pure compassion. It was escape. Tonight, Anna was experimenting with something revolutionary. Staying with herself when the discomfort arose. Her phone buzzed. A friend in crisis. The familiar pull tugged at her chest. The urge to drop everything and rush to the rescue. Anna stared at the phone screen. She could see the preview of the text. "Everything is falling apart. Can you call me?" 6 months ago, Anna would have called immediately. She would have dropped her own evening, her own needs, her own emotional state, and become whatever her friend needed. But instead of immediately responding, Anna paused. She noticed the anxiety in her body, the way her chest tightened, the familiar voice that said, "If you don't help right now, you're selfish." She noticed the way her own problems suddenly felt small and manageable compared to someone else's crisis. She noticed how much easier it was to focus on external drama than internal work. And then, for the first time in her adult life, she said something radical to that voice. "Maybe, but I'm staying here anyway." She set the phone aside and sat with the discomfort. This is what Jung called holding the tension of the opposites, learning to stay present with conflicting feelings without immediately acting to resolve them. Anna felt selfish and compassionate at the same time. She felt guilty and protective of her energy at the same time. She felt afraid and curious at the same time. For the first 10 minutes, her nervous system was in revolt. Every cell in her body was screaming at her to pick up the phone, to fix the crisis, to return to the familiar role of the rescuer. But Anna had been learning about Carl Jung's shadow, the unconscious patterns that drive us to overextend, overgive, and override our own needs in order to feel worthy. She had begun to understand that real individuation, as Jung taught, requires the courage to sit in that space between guilt and growth, to let go of who we think we must be in order to discover who we really are. And individuation, she was discovering, required the courage to disappoint people, not out of cruelty, but out of self-respect. As the minutes passed, something unexpected happened. She started to feel solid. For 20 minutes, she sat in her own presence without trying to fix, save, or serve anyone. And she didn't disappear. She didn't become a terrible person. She didn't stop caring about others. She just was, with herself, completely. Jung taught that individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, requires learning to tolerate the discomfort of not knowing who you are when you're not performing your familiar roles. Anna was discovering something profound. Her worth wasn't dependent on her productivity. Her value wasn't tied to her usefulness. Her right to exist wasn't conditional on how much she gave. She was learning what Jung called the reality of the soul, the understanding that you are inherently valuable, not because of what you do, but because of what you are, a unique expression of consciousness, here for reasons beyond performance. During those 20 minutes, Anna started to feel her own feelings instead of immediately trying to fix them. She felt sad about something that had happened at work. Instead of pushing the sadness away or immediately looking for someone to comfort, she let it move through her body like weather. She felt anxious about a decision she needed to make. Instead of seeking external validation or advice, she listened to her own inner wisdom. She felt lonely, not the desperate loneliness that drives you to rescue others, but the clean loneliness that comes from being honest about your human need for connection. When Anna finally picked up her phone an hour later, something had changed in the quality of her presence. She called her friend back, but this time, she listened from a place of choice, not compulsion. She offered support from a place of fullness, not emptiness. She cared from a place of strength, not desperation. The difference was subtle but revolutionary. She was helping because she wanted to, not because she needed to in order to feel valuable. Her friend could feel the difference. "You sound different," she said. "Calmer. More there." Anna smiled. For the first time in years, she was there. Not performing being there. Not strategically being there. Just there. This is the turning point every empath must face. The moment when solitude transforms from exile into sanctuary. Ask yourself, when was the last time you chose to be alone with yourself? Not because you had to, but because you wanted to explore who you are when no one is watching? When was the last time you felt your own feelings without immediately trying to fix them or use them to help someone else? When was the last time you sat in silence and didn't feel the urgent need to fill it with service to others? Jung wrote, "The most intense conflicts, if overcome, leave behind a sense of security and calm that is not easily disturbed." Anna was learning to overcome the conflict between her helper persona and her authentic self. And what she found in that resolution was something she'd been seeking her entire life: inner peace. 6 months into their separate journeys of learning to be alone, Elena, Marcus, and Anna discovered something that changed everything. Solitude wasn't punishment. It was permission. Permission to feel their own feelings without immediately trying to fix them. Permission to want things without feeling guilty. Permission to rest without earning it through exhaustion. Permission to exist without justifying their existence through service. Elena started taking long walks without her phone, not because she was avoiding people, but because she was learning to enjoy her own company. During these walks, she would practice what Jung called active imagination, allowing her mind to wander and her unconscious to speak. She discovered that when she wasn't constantly monitoring other people's emotional states, she could finally hear her own inner voice. And that voice had been trying to tell her things for years. It told her that she was tired of being the emotional caretaker in every relationship. It told her that she wanted to be seen and loved for who she was, not what she could provide. It told her that she had dreams and desires that had nothing to do with helping others. Marcus began cooking elaborate meals for himself, not because he was lonely, but because he deserved the same care he'd always given others. Each meal became a meditation on self-love, a practice of nourishing himself with the same attention he'd always reserved for others. He started to notice how foreign this felt, how guilty he felt for spending time and energy on something just for himself, how the voice in his head told him he was being selfish, indulgent, wasteful. But Jung had taught him something crucial. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Marcus was making his unconscious patterns conscious. He was seeing how deeply he'd internalized the belief that his needs didn't matter. And in seeing it, he could begin to change it. Anna started saying, "I need to think about it," instead of immediately saying yes to every request, not because she didn't care, but because she was learning that her time and energy were sacred. This simple phrase, "I need to think about it," became revolutionary for Anna. It created space between stimulus and response. It honored her right to make conscious choices instead of automatic reactions. At first, people were confused by this new Anna. They were used to her immediate availability, her reflexive yes, her willingness to drop everything. Some people didn't like the change. They pushed back. They guilt-tripped. They accused her of becoming selfish. And Anna learned something important. The people who were most upset by her boundaries were the people who had been most dependent on her lack of boundaries. This wasn't selfishness. This was what Jung called self-realization, the courageous act of becoming who you actually are instead of who you think you should be. They discovered that their capacity to love others actually deepened when they stopped loving from a place of need and started loving from a place of choice. When Elena stopped needing to be needed, she became genuinely helpful instead of compulsively helpful. She could see people's actual needs instead of projecting her own need to be needed onto every situation. When Marcus stopped people-pleasing out of fear, he became authentically kind instead of performatively kind. His kindness had boundaries. It was sustainable. It came from a full cup instead of an empty one. When Anna stopped overgiving to avoid guilt, she became truly generous instead of resentfully generous. She gave because she wanted to, when she wanted to, in ways that honored both herself and others. Carl Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." But he also understood that this terror is the gateway to freedom. Because when you're no longer afraid of being alone with yourself, you're no longer desperate for others to validate your existence. When you're no longer avoiding your own pain, you're no longer compulsively trying to fix everyone else's pain. When you're no longer running from your own darkness, you're no longer threatened by others' darkness. You become unshakable, not because you're hard or disconnected, but because you're rooted in something deeper than the opinions, needs, or moods of others. You're rooted in your own soul. The paradox that every empath must learn is this: the deeper your relationship with yourself, the more authentic your relationships with others become. Because you're no longer meeting people from a place of lack, looking for them to fill the void you're afraid to face. You're meeting them from a place of fullness, able to see them clearly because you're no longer projecting your unmet needs onto them. You're no longer loving them to avoid loving yourself. You're loving them because you've learned how to love yourself. And that changes everything. Elena discovered that when she stopped being the family's emotional manager, they learned to manage their own emotions. And their relationships became more honest, more real, more connected. Marcus discovered that when he stopped being everyone's therapist, his friendships deepened. People started seeing him as a whole person, not just a service provider. Anna discovered that when she stopped rescuing everyone, she attracted people who didn't need rescuing. Her relationships became more balanced, more reciprocal, more nourishing. Jung called this process individuation, the lifelong journey of becoming who you truly are. And for empaths, individuation requires learning the revolutionary art of putting themselves first. Not in a selfish way, in a sacred way. Because you can't give what you don't have. You can't love others from an empty well. You can't heal the world while ignoring your own wounds. The most radical thing an empath can do is learn to be alone without feeling useless. Because in that aloneness, they discover something extraordinary. They are enough, just as they are, without performing, without serving, without earning their worth through sacrifice. They are enough. Here's what Carl Jung understood that most people miss. Your greatest strength isn't your ability to be useful to others. Your greatest strength is your willingness to be useless to your ego and essential to your soul. When you stop performing worthiness and start embodying worthiness, you become magnetic in a completely different way. People are drawn to your presence, not your performance. They feel safe in your energy, not just grateful for your service. They experience your love as a gift, not a transaction, because you've learned a secret that changes everything. You don't need to be needed to be valuable. You don't need to be indispensable to be loved. You don't need to be everything to everyone to be enough. Elena, Marcus, and Anna discovered that their fear of being alone was actually a fear of being themselves. And when they finally met themselves in the silence, really met themselves with curiosity instead of judgment, they found someone worth knowing, someone worth loving, someone worth being. Jung said, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens." You've been dreaming that your worth lives in your usefulness. It's time to awaken to the truth that your worth lives in your existence. This awakening is the heart of Carl Jung's shadow work. To stop confusing your identity with your utility. To face the terrifying silence where no one needs you and find that you are still there. The empath who learns to be alone doesn't become selfish. They become sovereign. They don't stop caring about others. They start caring about themselves with the same tenderness they've always given away. They don't become hard. They become unshakable because they've found the one person who will never leave them, never use them, and never need them to be anything other than exactly who they are, themselves. Here's your invitation to begin this journey. Tonight, before you go to sleep, spend 10 minutes alone with yourself. No phone, no distractions, no rushing to help anyone. Just you with you. Notice what comes up. Notice the urge to distract yourself, to find someone to help, to do anything other than simply be present with yourself. And stay anyway. Notice, you don't disappear when you stop performing. You appear. This is what Jung called the encounter with the self, the moment when you stop running from your own presence and start inhabiting it fully. If this video has touched something in you, if you recognize yourself in Elena's midnight scrolling, Marcus's rage, or Anna's revolutionary pause, then you're ready for the most important relationship of your life, the relationship with yourself. Comment below with these words if you're ready to begin. I choose loneliness. I choose myself, not because you don't love others, but because you're finally ready to learn how to love yourself. The world doesn't need another exhausted empath giving from an empty cup. The world needs empaths who give from fullness, not emptiness. The world needs helpers who serve from choice, not compulsion. The world needs you, the real you, not the performance you. And that person, that beautiful, complex, sometimes difficult, always worthy person, they're waiting for you in the silence. Go find them, because when you're no longer afraid to be alone, you become unshakable. And the world needs unshakable empaths now more than ever.